All right, let's talk about the siege of Bexar and what actually happened. But before we get started, I want you to pause the video and answer this question. Do you think a siege was a good idea for the Texas Army? So the Texas Army started the siege on October 12th. So they made their circle nice and tight. The Mexican army's inside this red circle in Bexar, and then they waited. And they waited and they waited and they waited. And remember, a siege takes a long time because you're really just trying to make sure these people run out of supplies inside your circle. But what happened was the Texans got really bored sitting there. It was months. We're talking months from October to December, actually, they sat there. And you already know what the weather's like about this time of year. It's kind of yucky and cold and rainy, and they're sitting out there and they're far from home. And remember, these people, the Texans, are not soldiers. They're mostly farmers. And they're sitting and they're sitting and they're sitting. What happens is a lot of them start to go home. So I want you to stop the video and answer the second question. So put number 2 on your paper. Why do you think the Texans started going home? Well, while they waited, some of the leaders of the Texas Army started trying to decide if maybe they should just quit this crazy idea they had to fight Mexico and just go back home altogether. A lot of people had already left. They could just go home until this guy had enough of it. One evening, they were sitting around the fire, and this guy, whose name is Ben Milam, was sitting there. And Ben Milam had actually come to Texas with Jane Long and her husband, and he had actually fought in the Mexican Revolution against Spain. And he was about 47 at this time. That's kind of old for back then, actually. And he had to use a cane to walk around because he was pretty old. And he was sitting there and he's like, you know what? I came to Texas to fight for freedom from Spain. And now we've got President Santa Anna making things bad for us again. And I did not do all of that all that time ago and move and do all these things for Texas and just to see it be bad again. I'm just tired of it. I'm not putting it up with it. And he stands up by the fire and he's like, look, if you sissy babies want to go home and just forget about this whole thing, you can. But I'm going in there and I'm getting rid of these Mexican soldiers and I'm sending a message to Santa Anna that he needs to quit acting like this. And he drew a line in the sand and he said, who's coming to go with me to in there to fight the Mexican soldiers tonight? No more waiting around, no more siege. Who's going with old Ben Milam? And he just kept saying it. Who's going with old Ben Milam? I can barely walk. I got a cane, but I'm going to go in there and fight the Mexican soldiers. Any of you guys going to go with me? And if you want to go, just step across this line. And you can imagine that a lot of them did. So what I want you to answer next is how would have you answered Milam's who will come and go with old Ben Milam's questions? What would you have said? Well, a lot of people said, oh my goodness, if this old guy's going to go in there and fight, we better too. So in the middle of the night on December 5th, they got up and they started going house to house fighting the Mexican soldiers. Now, at first, they had the element of surprise. It was the middle of the night. Probably some of the Mexican soldiers were in their PJs. And so at first, it was a little bit easier. But as it went on, it took them about 5 days to get the Mexican soldiers to surrender. But they did surrender. And when they finally did, Martin de Cos, that's the leader of the Mexican army, that's this guy, who also happens to be the president of Mexico's brother-in-law. This is Santa Anna's brother-in-law, Martin de Cos. And he says, please don't kill us. We give up. We promise to go back to Mexico and never come back again if you just let us live. And so the Texas soldiers said, okay, if you promise never to go, never to come back and never to fight against Texas again, you can leave. Number 4 on your paper. Do you think Koss will keep his promise and not come back? Number 5. What would you have done with the Mexican army? Now, we'll see what happens next after this has happened, but we're going to pause our story here after the siege of Bexar, in which the Texans win. By the way, only about 5 Texas soldiers, we're not sure of the number, but it was very few, 4 or 5 Texas soldiers were all that were killed, and as many as 300 Mexican soldiers were killed in this battle. So I can't wait to tell you what happens next, but as we stop our story here, the Texans have now gotten all of the Mexican soldiers out of Mexico, headed out of Texas and headed to Mexico. Can't wait to tell